A very warm welcome. We're glad you're still with us here on Morning at NTV. For those that are just joining us, welcome to Take Note segment, where we shall be looking at government moves to regulate religious organizations, and we shall be delving into the proposed policy that is, of course, going to do that regulation and ask the fundamentals: should religion and religious organizations' work be regulated in the manner that is proposed. Now, government is embarking on formulating what's being described as a comprehensive and clear national policy framework to govern the registration and regulation of religious and faith organizations. The policy, championed by the Directorate of Ethics and Integrity under the Office of the President, says let there be transparency in these religious institutions. How you put that transparency measure in the institution is up to the church leaders. However, many stakeholders are feeling uncomfortable, and with this particular policy formulation, they say it threatens some values that they do hold dear, and they are willing to tussle it out in order to ensure that this particular issue is at least done in the most decent of ways. I'm joined on set by Simon Ssenyonga, a lawyer and pastor. I'm also joined by Kassim Kamugisha, the Deputy Resident City Commissioner for Nakawa. He's also a Sheikh. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, the topic is one that is touchy, just like religion is very touchy. And many times when you begin introspection into matters, religion and faith, there is a very thin line and you need to tread very carefully. But if you don't mind, allow me go to Sheikh Kassim Kamugisha first on the whole idea of rolling out new policy framework that seeks to regulate faith-based organizations, and in this particular case we are looking at churches because they form the greater bulk of faith-based organizations. What do you understand by this whole goings on?
Chris, good morning viewers, and Chris, as you said, it's trading on a thin line, and especially for myself, because I am part of the presidency as a Deputy RCC.
That's
and this
right.
is where the policy is coming from.
That's right.
But at the same time, I'm a member of executive, Uganda Muslim Supreme Council. So it's a
You're in a sport of bother.
it calls for training carefully. But the whole issue is, one, Uganda is not unique in the whole world in terms of looking forward to having regulations or regulating the RFOs, religious and faith-based organizations. It's all over. However, the approaches are different. In some jurisdictions, you find regulations are towards curtailing regions from interfering with the politics.
Yeah.
In some states where we have got theocratic governments, the state has a state religion and therefore has to regulate it in terms of how it operates. The case in point could be Saudi Arabia, you have Indonesia, you have Vatican. Then in other areas, states regulate religions because they are financing the religious and faith-based organizations. And for the case of Uganda, we don't fall in any of the three. What the state is looking at, in my own view, not in the view of my office, in my own view, is there could be a few scattered elements where the state feels that maybe religious institutions are going overboard. And maybe feels it could come in, but very, very alive to the fact that the Constitution of Republic of Uganda still gives freedoms for people to practice religion,
that's right.
but also for the state to ensure that it creates an environment where RFOs operates freely and independently. And for some of the excesses which have been cited across the board, are, for example, the matters of integrity in these institutions, but also leaders of the institutions.
That's right.
In terms of the social integrity, then economic integrity. Then secondly, matters of excesses in terms of extremism, whereby in some instances you had rebel organizations, for example, linked to religions. Across the board, you had Resistance Army, you had Holy Spirit movement, then you have the ADF, which is rampant. And of course, you have instances where the Financial Intelligence Authority is pointing at some monies which come in from various sources that cannot be accounted for. And therefore the state feels compelled in some way or another to say, but why don't we put our eye somewhere? But of course, as religious institutions, they can't sit back and say, you please come. Because not all that I have said is in every church, in every mosque. There are places where they feel they are clean in terms of integrity. They can give accountabilities for their monies. And they are not, for example, depriving other people's rights when they're exercising their rights. And that therefore causes a thin line that when you are to bring this policy, there should be a very broad discussion. And of course, that raises questions of, for example, is there draft policy? Yes. Were we part of the draft policy? Because I worked in the Religious Council of Uganda for quite some time.
That's right.
At the level of a director. And this discussion has been going on internally. And what religious institutions always say is, when this policy was being drafted, were we consulted? And at what level? What did we agree on? So therefore, this calls for further scrutiny of every stage of this policy to the level of acceptance. And that's why, for example, in Parliament, when one of the MPs came up with a bill, it collapsed at inception because many questions were raised. But moving forward, the state has got a cardinal role of facilitating and guiding development, economic, political, and social.
All right.
And that cannot exonerate religious institutions, but there must be a dialogue, continuous, there must be an agreement, and there must be acceptance from religious institutions for the state to really have a firm grip on its interference.
Okay, thank you very much for that submission, Sheikh Kassim Kamugisha. Of course, when you speak about the broader discussion, it speaks to the fact that this is a very broad issue, no doubt about it, and some of the aspects that government might want to look at might eat into aspects that the religious leaders and especially the administrators of these faith-based organizations consider to be a no-go area based on what conceptions of a particular line of religion is. But allow me come to Simon Ssenyonga. You're a lawyer. Have you had time to peruse the proposed draft, what it seeks, and how the breakdown of which particular areas the government wants to go for in terms of monitoring, because this all comes on the backdrop of increasing effort by the government to look into just about everything and every institution for many reasons, including the need to recoup as much revenue as possible. And it is debated that churches do hold a lot of money in terms of offerings, donations from well-wishers, but also those that are aligned to business and public service delivery. There is that aspect of money coming through. Take us through what you've read.
Thank you again. Good morning, viewers. Thank you very much, Chris, for At NTV for hosting me again.
You're most welcome.
Now, personally, I've been at the center of this discussion way back.
By the way, I forgot to emphasize that you're both a lawyer and a pastor.
Yes.
The reason he's also here, you've been you've held offices and Sheikh.
So I have some knowledge of the law.
Of course.
Now, first of all, for you to appreciate the discussion, you have to detach yourself from any form of bias that comes with what ultimately the state intends to do, specifically in regards to what will cause a public uproar. You see, as you say, the subject is extremely touchy. It's extremely sensitive. Now, most of the people, especially the proponents of the policy, in my view, seek to twist the discussion to center it on only issues which will be seemingly sensational, specifically the issues concerning money. But you see, the debate around this policy stretches beyond money.
Beyond money, yeah.
For you to have a fair appreciation of this, you have to appreciate that, number one, is there first of all a constitutional right to freedom of worship? Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
And now as a lawyer, I'll just try to make the public understand a few fair things here and there. Article 7 of the Constitution gives us perspective that Uganda is, so to say, a secular state. Now, when you read Article 7, it creates two roles that the state has to follow. What you call in law a positive role and a negative role. A positive role, like what my brother hinted on, to support and to ensure that religious organizations are able to operate freely and comfortably. Then there is a negative role to also ensure that in all ways it detaches itself from any form or nature or perspective that will subsequently curtail that freedom. Now, when you read Article 29 of the Constitution, it gives the final basis of what the freedom of worship is. That, you know, there is you have an opportunity to express your freedom of faith, your freedom of worship. And this freedom of worship has two angles to it. It has what I have as a belief, the unseen part of the faith, the unseen part of the freedom, and then it has the expressive part of the freedom. Now, in creating a regulation, you must make sure that you are not in any way, because the state does not have the duty to be an arbiter in religious matters by constitutional principle, by precedent, by common understanding, among other things. Let's get into what this policy actually says. And I will highlight for you the things that people never want to tell you about the policy. The policy doesn't actually seek ultimately to focus on the financing of religious institutions. That's one of the least areas it's focusing on. You mentioned one of the critical things. It seeks to apparently create a standard of accountability and appropriate standards. When you read the policy, which I have here, it says that the overall aim is to ensure promotion of high and generally acceptable ethical standards and operational norms. That means that the state is sitting in the seat of being the determinant of what is acceptable ethical standards and norms. So number one, the general deception that goes out there, especially when you read through the media, as per the policy, is that there are extreme cases, especially from, normally the easier bait is the Pentecostal churches.
The born-again movement.
But without even reading so much English, the name of this policy is called the National Religious and Faith Organizations Policy. When you read the glossary of the policy, it describes religion to be, or faith organizations to be, a religious grouping in which persons with a common religious belief, faith, missions, or spiritual values worship God together. And in that context, it says the churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples. Now, that means the policy is not only targeting the Pentecostals, it's targeting everyone. Now, there is a comfortable seat that especially our colleagues from the Director of Ethics and Integrity want us to believe that this policy is only dealing with the few extreme cases, especially amongst the Pentecostals. They don't want to tell you that, for example, this policy seeks to curtail all the religions. He mentioned something very fundamental. What does this policy do? It is putting all faith to be under the office of the president. It is putting all faith and all religions to be under the Director of Ethics and Integrity. Now, I don't know whether you were around in the Amin days. What happened in the Amin days was that there was a whole ministry.
I wasn't around.
You are not around. But I mean, as a person who has some knowledge, there was a ministry in charge of religion and religious affairs.
Wow.
And the intention of that was to, and if you read even our legislation, Uganda is still registered under the AU laws as an Islamic-based state.
And not really.
That has changed.
It's a member of OIC.
It's a member of the Islamic organization.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, whatever you would want to interpret it as, but in effect, that's what it does. Not just in a mere principle.
Okay, that's another debate.
That's another debate for another day. So number one, the policy seeks to put all faith under the office of the president. It seeks that there will be what they are calling, you talked about transparency. What is their aspect of transparency? Transparency for the government is not in the context of stating principles. No. It is saying that the policy is going to create what is called a Religious and Faith Organizations Board. which I'm sure he's aware of. That board is to have 10 members, right? Of those 10 members, a few of them are to be appointed by the government, but specifically, which is more problematic, is that the regulation seeks to curtail all people to be under umbrellas or networks. When you read the section concerning self-regulation, they are saying that you must be part of a network or an umbrella. So your individual expression of your faith is not being given context. So everybody is being pushed to be under that. Now, that specific board is going to have the power, number one, to control, to determine, to register, to regulate. When I give you authority to register me, that means you can deregister me. Now, that will eventually mean that this board, which is under the office of the president, can choose, can wake up and say, this one I think
is no longer a church,
you're no longer a church or a mosque or any form of expression of your faith. That's extremely problematic. Now, number two, sorry, quickly, just very quickly.
Yeah.
The policy seeks to turn faith into a government program. Now, for example, when you read, you will get a chance to read the policy. It talks about one of the principles of its operation is what they're calling a program-based approach. Now, historically, I'm sure you've been around, historically, the program-based approach took a bigger twist when they were introducing the new budgetary perspective, where now it moved away from government, purely ministry financing to program-based financing. So what this policy is going to do, it subjects all manner of faith into a program of government. That's where now issues of financing come in. They're saying that you must align yourself to government interests and financing. So you must be able to declare, you must be able to align. At one point, it's going to come where they say, now you must be able to only speak about what the government authorizes. So faith is no longer going to be what...
That is a fear.
No, it's not a fear. It's not a fear
on your part.
It's not a fear.
Yeah.
But I'm reading for you actually what is in the policy. If I only had a chance, I could take you through back to back.
Of course, going through the entire policy won't work for our time that we have right now. But allow me just return to Kassim Kamugisha and look at the fact that maybe, and this I must emphasize, maybe government, given the need to intervene within the population and the advantage that faith-based organizations have when interfacing with the population, wants to go for a particular dividend in terms of service delivery. Is that something that is plausible?
Without fear of contradiction, religious faith-based organizations have played a very fundamental role, and therefore there are dividends within their population, and which the state has also recouped from.
Yeah.
For example, all traditional education services were offered by RFOs until 1954, when government schools were established by Education Ordinance of 1954. Basically, most of the oldest healthcare service providers were bending towards religious-based organizations. And so those are dividends to the state. But what the state could be saying in the framework is, how coordinated are these services? Because maybe it is looking at a situation where it is becoming, for example, a competition, which competition is good because it brings out the best output. But what could be the negative results of competition? That's number one. Number two, we're at the state, because constitutionally, the state should provide an environment for people to exercise their faith, because it is their right under Article 29(1). But could they be infringing on the rights of others, which could be a negative dividend to the population, and which could have maybe caused a crash with the state, which could be a negative dividend? And so the state is saying, maybe, can we, yes, give dividends, but when we are coordinated. So the state could be looking at coordinating these religious institutions to contribute to national development agenda.
Okay.
And then number two, yes, whereas you are substituting the state, but could there be issues of integrity? Could there be issues of of, for example, extortion to the public. Because we have seen cases where, last year we read something about a Serere team of 273 who were promised to go to heaven in Ethiopia. They moved to Nairobi and they got stranded, and someone had taken their money.
That's right.
We saw issues in Kanungo of Chibwete having picked people's money and finally killed them. So the state is saying, whereas there could be dividends, but can we work in a manner which is coordinated but which is also integrity-based? Then moving forward, how do we then recoup dividends from the religious faith of organizations, but in line, in conformity with the existing laws?
Okay.
And so, as I said earlier, it's a debate. Whereas the RFOs would feel in a way pressed. But I think there could be a few scattered elements of the goodness in the policy. Actually, it is a draft policy.
It's a draft policy, no doubt.
It's a draft policy, which could require us to now have a discussion and say, where could we have an input? What could be to our advantage? And then if it becomes a policy, then it is subject to continuous amendment to fit in the situation. But what I don't agree with is there cannot be a board, a governing board.
A governing board for
religious faith organizations. Why? Because you cannot govern Muslims. You know, you can't govern Muslims
with
the Christians, with Orthodox, the same manner. Even at Interreligious Council of Uganda, the working together is for the common good, not for the theological point of view.
Not for the theological point of view.
So you cannot have a governing body, but you can have a body which coordinates with the activities, which checks, for example, integrity, but not forgetting that we still have rules which can check our integrity, because if I extorted the money from my sheep in the church, there is a law, there is a penal code.
Law. Now, okay, that's interesting, but let me ask Simon.
Yes.
Of course, the draft has so many things that government seeks to, but we are choosing to look at the quick pain points for religious faith organizations, but also what government could be looking at. If the church, the Islamic faith, were approached and given sufficient consultation, as Mr. Kamugisha wants, what would be what are you willing to let the government look at, and what are you not ready to let the government look into?
Okay,
it's a very important question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Number one, this is what I'm letting the government to look at. The discussion around policy development in this nation should be centered, number one, first of all, with effective implementation of already existent laws.
Yeah.
That's the starting point. Now, the moment you make me appreciate that, for example, because what are the concerns that are emerging about this policy development? Number one, issues of integrity. Do we have an anti-corruption court? Do we have anti-corruption laws? Yes, they are there. Do we have punitive laws, which are, in the criminal justice system, the penal code, and all those supportive laws? Yes, they are there. Do we have, for example, I think that you talked about government coordination of programs. So they keep on, I think one of the things that this policy throws around is that there seems to be a lack of coordination in government affairs. But I'll give you an example. There is a whole plethora of arrangements. For example, if the state wanted to work with non-state actors, under the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, non-state actors work with government. There are a couple of MOUs which are always reviewed. And there is, even if you went to the local government level, there's what is called the district development officers. Those are the people who directly work with RFOs at the local level. So for you to persuade me that this policy is relevant, you must justify that you've effectively implemented all other laws. It is very dangerous for you to legislate on each and every issue in this country. As an advocate, I will tell you, Uganda has a history of that nitty-gritty kind of legislation. Do we need to talk about the Public Code and Management Act? It came at the helm of when there were the walk to work campaigns. Has it effectively worked? I don't think so. You talk about, I think, our brother Mama Babazi. At one point, he never thought that he would have presidential ambitions. While in Parliament, he advocated for the Interception of Communications Act to tap phone calls. The very law that he talked about was used against him. The Anti-Pornography Act, some of all these regulations. You just cannot legislate on each and everything. Now, that is what, for me, all right? Or if I was to persuade the people of religious, even if it was non-religious people. Number one, that's not something you need to let go of. Number two, in the creation of policies, you must make sure that at the most bare minimum, even before talking about implementation of other laws, there are guidelines that are given to the public under the public Ministry of Public Service that are supposed to be followed in the development of every policy. One of those is the principle of evidence-based research in development of a policy. My brother here will tell you, probably having sat at the Interreligious Council, that number one, the evidence, to talk about cogent evidence that is relevant to justify a policy, you don't simply pick scattered incidents. And I want you to take something very carefully here. Him as the one who works in the state will know that even the selection of examples given in the justification of this policy is very tactical. You talk about, you talk about ADF, you talk about Chibwetere, you talk about some of these people they have quoted, they are splinter groups. Now, it could be a trigger, but it's not an ultimate justification. You must have evidence that is sufficient for us to actually, in law, what we call, that you're going to justify what is called a mischief. Because any law must come to address a mischief. Now, in policy development, you must be able to give us the evidence that justifies a mischief. It can't be based on scattered evidence.
Interesting there. I want to ask this question, and both of you are going to have to give me an answer. Do we all appreciate and understand the vulnerability of a people, especially when it comes to faith? Do we appreciate that a people are vulnerable at the point of belief in whatever God or religion, and at that particular point they are bound to take on certain aspects that might not be readily necessary or even good for their own well-being? Do we agree with that?
Certainly, that is a
and just yes or no, first tell me that. Do you agree that the human mind is vulnerable?
You see, Chris, for me to answer yes or no, I'll just tell you this. If I came and asked you, did your father stop beating your mother? Tell me yes or no.
Stop?
Yes.
That is, if there is a trajectory to that. Exactly.
And if you say yes, that means you're accepting the fact, right? If you say no, you're accepting the fact.
That is before you flip this on me.
No, I'm not flipping it on you. I'm only giving you so that you can have context to your questions. So for you to simply pause for me a question and you say, are they vulnerable? When you put me into a yes or no, there must be a backup to that.
There must be backup to that.
Yes, so that's why I'm asking you. If I told you, did your father stop beating your mother? If you say yes, that means
that is when you have a fact and you're coming with that fact, the knowledge that perhaps that happened, but it would be completely off the mark if I know it hasn't happened, but you're asking the question. So the context disappears. How about you? Do you believe that the population or people for that matter might be vulnerable at any one point when it comes to interfacing with faith issues and beliefs?
It's a two-way. Actually, a population can erupt when three things are tampered with: religion, family, and culture. But also they are vulnerable to manipulations.
Exactly.
To manipulations.
And don't you think that is what the state...
And you see, as I said, 273 were moved from Serere to Kenya. Why? Because they had lost hope. And they thought they could be saved by crossing to where they are going, heaven. That was because of vulnerability. But also in other incidences, Kanung, it was because people were vulnerable, wanted spiritual healing, and they fell into a ditch. So it's a two-way. People can be vulnerable, but they can still erupt because of religion. Now, the point I want to make is it's a thin line that has to be treated carefully between the state players and non-state players, so that we can have a desired result for both players.
Okay.
Maybe just also to further build up on that, the question of vulnerability. You see, when you come to matters concerning faith and religion and belief, what for you may seem in the public eye as vulnerability could be a pure belief in what people have chosen to believe in. Now, the danger, again, what you call the delicate balance. The delicate balance is that does the state want to be an arbiter in determining what is acceptable or non-acceptable. What I think the state should focus on is enforcing the laws which are already existent, as opposed to creating a unique law which is actually going to cause more vulnerability. The vulnerability isn't in the people believing, but it's actually in creating a delicate balance, whether the state wants to be an arbiter in issues of faith and religion.
Gentlemen, many thanks. Time is not my best ally right now, but of course your submissions have emboldened our understanding of the intentions, but perhaps the debate will continue. So many thin lines to actually trade, and of course so many people are going to have to be very careful. Let me now go to Stephen Mbide, our man on the ground. This